I ask you to please pay close attention. I will make sure to deliver my remarks slowly because I'm going to present a lot of information and to discuss the history of China. And I'm going to cite many facts. Perhaps many of these will be unknown to you or to many of you. And these are surprising and perhaps incredible facts. I can tell you in advance that these are all historically documented facts based on serious studies, which I will cite in the written version of this presentation. And so I begin to spell them out. When arrived in China for the first time in 1978, and I arrived to stay, China was a communist country, which it began to stop being as of that date. And it was a poor country, the 120th power in the world in terms of GDP. These two circumstances were surprising to any Westerner coming from the developed world. Well, no. What most surprised me was that I began to discover that China was another world. And I have continued discovering, confirming, and studying it over these last 42 years. Leibniz put it in different words. China is another planet. Let's look at this. The West and China are two very different worlds. The Chinese have fully internalized this, and many of their intellectuals and politicians have studied it fully. We Westerners in general do not know it. We don't accept it, or at least we haven't internalized it. And many of our intellectuals and politicians don't know about this, as we have seen in a recent discussion with Spanish politicians. They don't recognize these differences. In general, we think, in fact, we are convinced, that our world is the only one and is unique, and that whatever doesn't fit in this, our world, is not valid, or it isn't acceptable, or it isn't right. For the West and China to understand each other, to dialogue, to collaborate, to trade, even to disagree, it is indispensable that we come down off our pedestal and that we begin by knowing and recognizing that China is another world or another planet. Starting with history, briefly. Don't be frightened. China has a historical past going back 5,000 years based on an empire which began 2,300 years ago on a territory almost the same as that of today, with slight variations of its borders, with the same written language, with a homogeneous population over centuries, enriched by diverse contributions of 56 ethnic groups. And that China has been, over 2,500 years, over these years, between 20 and 25% of the entire world's population. And it has represented, from year one until 1840, more than 20% and up to 30% of world GDP. This means, in other words, that China was the first economic power of the world for 2,000 years. China is the only empire, the only country that, other than short periods of convulsions or dynastic changes, continued to develop and evolved on approximately the same territory and with the same ethnic groups over centuries. This is one of its unique characteristics which make it different from other parts of the world. The rest of us were born yesterday or the day before yesterday. And that empire, that country, has been built especially over the last 2,500 years. That is, since the establishment of the empire with the Han Dynasty until today, on philosophical, ethical, and political bases which are very different from those of the West. On Confucian philosophy, which all public servants were required to study and were only admitted to their political positions after very demanding exams. in the Temple of Confucius in Beijing, if you go, you can read engraved in stone the names of those who won those examinations for the highest positions of the imperial government up until 1911. The Chinese Empire, unlike Western empires, is not based on the nobility in order to govern, but rather on the mandarins, their best trained subjects. Confucius developed his ideas more than a century before Aristotle or Plato, and those ideas adapted, evolved, and were enriched over the centuries by many thinkers who make up Confucian philosophy today. Confucianism is like the hard drive of Chinese civilization, a world of ideas and values, which I insist is very different from that of Western thinking. For example, in Confucian thought, the collectivity prevails over the individual. The good of society is above the individual good. The Chinese dream is not the triumph of the individual, nor personal individual success, but rather it is the success of the collectivity, of society, of the prosperity of all, and only in that collective context is personal success applauded. Therefore, we can assert that Chinese civilization and Western civilization constitute two very different worlds, very different histories, and very different values. Two worlds that can be open to dialogue or to confrontation. Two worlds that have, for centuries, lived with their backs turned to each other and at a great distance from each other. For example, in the first century, the Roman Empire and its splendor represented 8% of world GDP. The Chinese Empire was 21% of GDP of the world. During the early Middle Ages, cities were being created in Europe, such as Aachen, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, with 15,000 inhabitants and one single embassy. Xi'an, at the time capital of the Chinese Empire, had 2 million inhabitants and 250 embassies. In 1421, another historical fact, at the inauguration of Beijing as the new capital of the empire, it was attended by over a period of 2 years by visitors from more than 300 countries or territories, none of them Western. We are living with our backs turned to China. Beijing was inaugurated as the capital with 1.5 million inhabitants when Rome had 50,000, London 10,000, and New York didn't even exist. Two worlds at a great distance from each other and very much with their backs turned to each other. The Rome of Augustus hears about the country of Ceres, or of something exotic, that is to say of silk. And Emperor Tiberius, 20 years later, tries to stop its importation because, quote, the coffers of his empire were being emptied, close quote. Does this remind you of anything? The Silk Road, with its more than 15,000 kilometers of land routes, was the world's most important trade route for 15 centuries. That route and the tales of Marco Polo opened the West's eyes about an unknown great empire. And in the 16th to 18th centuries, the West spent half of the silver it had looted from the Americas on Chinese products. So this is like the scandal of who wins from trade. Still today, there are tons of Spanish silver coins of that time in the Popular Bank of China. Two worlds that barely know each other and that ignore each other, with some exceptions also in history. One of these, the Matteo Ricci's Jesuits, who between the 16th and 18th centuries settled in China and gained great prestige as intellectuals and scientists. They were Renaissance men, and they were even respected and admired by various emperors. They established a long dialogue with Confucian scholars and with the enlightened people of the Chinese Empire and with Chinese civilization. That dialogue was truncated by the lack of understanding of his superiors and Pope Benedict XVI, who condemned the dialogue as heretical. Another exception, the England of George III, which found itself with a sizable trade deficit with China, very unequal. We almost had nothing to sell them. And in 1840, England launched 2 opium wars along with its allies to forcibly impose the free trade of drug trafficking. That was the beginning of the drug trade, which we still suffer from today. And so the West invaded, occupied, and colonized the richest third of Chinese territory for a century, which the Chinese refer to as the century of humiliation. The West thereby became, at that time, the aggressive enemy of China. Moving from this brief historical overview, from which many details are clearly missing, let us turn to the current situation. China, the China which has emerged today, has transformed into the second world power, and it returns to the international sphere with a new force, and it is returned to stay. Don't forget that. It is returned to stay. I say this often in my presentation because this is going to be a historical fact over the 21st century. We were so immersed in our world that we were kept largely ignoring that other world that is China, which leapt from poverty to accelerated development. We just didn't know about it, and now we find that China has arrived. We didn't even take into account that in September 1945, China had been one of the victorious powers in the Second World War. Almost nobody remembers that. They were the victor powers against Nazism and Japanese militarist supremacism. That was September of 1945. The Second World War wasn't in April, that was in Europe. It was in September in Asia. And when that war ended, we organized the world our way without even including China in the international institutions, except for the United Nations. And we are surprised and irritated that China now intends to have the position it's due in the international community, given its economic, technological, and political weight. This irritates us, this frightens us, and so conflicts arise. For some of the West, the solution is trade warfare, technological warfare, a war of discrediting, disparagement, and slander. A few even believe that the solution has to be a military confrontation. We'll discuss this further in the discussion period. They want to return to the military confrontation. They want to return to the opium wars on behalf of our free trade, with the difference that China today is very well prepared. For others in the West, also in the West, of which I am one, and a very convinced one, the solution is, first, knowledge and mutual respect, respect for the sovereignty of countries and their idiosyncrasies. Second, dialogue, discussion, negotiation to resolve our differences, which clearly, as we've been stating, are many and very deep. Is this utopian? Well, I'm signing up for that utopia, which I believe can become reality, because two cannot fight if one of them does not want to. And China, as we have just heard from the authoritative voice of Mr. Yao Fei, promotes dialogue and negotiation. China has demonstrated this over its historical trajectory, based on its Confucian political thinking, as we have noted. Many of us political analysts have been calling for and defending the need for a new global order to gradually replace the world order which we Westerners established after World War II, with the idea of not frightening anyone. We are not alone in the world. We have no right to impose ourselves on others, nor to impose our rules of the game as the only ones and the best ones. There are already new actors on the stage of international relations, and others will appear shortly. And we have to make way for them, even though we be strong enough to stop it or slow it down. And the first of those new actors, given its importance, obviously, is China, that other world that we need to know and understand, and with which we are obligated to dialogue and negotiate. Thank you very much, and we will continue the discussion during the question and answer period.